I've been a dirty mill player for a very long time, not only in Magic the Gathering, but I've had my fair share of mill, rogue, and Hearthstone, and I've also been recently championing Nami in the One Piece TCG. Mill rogue is a combo strategy, looking to recur a bunch of cards, play them out, take cards off your opponent's deck. It's a combo deck through and through. Nami in the One Piece TCG is a defensive strategy, looking to defend and draw and ultimately get to the point where you have 0 cards in deck, where your leader then says you win the game. But mill in Magic the Gathering takes many different forms. It could be combo, it could be defensive, it could be aggressive as well. We have self-mill, we have milling your opponent, we have many different ways to achieve the alternate win condition, if you will. But that doesn't come without its salt. Many people don't like playing against mill. They feel like they're losing a sense of control, and they feel like they don't have the strategy that they came to play the game with. They've lost the cards out of their library that they no longer have access to, and that leads to a lot of rage. And that's one of the many reasons why I believe mill can be unfun for the player itself, creating a maybe negative environment, and for the people playing against it. That's why I love it. But I wanted to take a look through a video that popped up on my feed today called "Why is Mill Unfun?" Card game design video essay by this channel called Game Deconstructed, and I wanted to see what they had as reasoning. I saw some Pokemon in there as well, so I thought maybe they would provide a perspective on different TCGs as well. So really interested to see what's going on. Of course, as always, when I do these react videos, I highly recommend you click on the video, let it play out in the background since we're already watching it, give the video its time on the algorithm, and leave a comment and boost up these great videos here. Let's see what they have to say about why this great archetype is so unfun for people. Looks like we got some Hearthstone and some Magic the Gathering Arena and a little bit of Pokemon. Let's see. I'm hoping they do go through some different games here.
I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and this is why card game players hate mill. There will be a couple of factors to consider here, some of them mechanical, some of them more on the thematic side, so let's get started. Starting with the first one, mill simply plays the game on a different axis. Right. If your opponent's focus is on hitting you with creatures, they are in a good position to gauge how much effort, luck, and skill goes into you also hitting them with creatures. If you are attacking alongside a completely different axis, they are not in a great position to gauge what percentage of these factors was involved.
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why people feel like mill takes them out of their comfort zone and takes away their control in the game. So a common example I like to bring up is specifically in modern mill in the old days when you played the Death Shadow matchup. A very common tactic was actually to board out all of your crabs, your ruin crabs and your hedron crabs, because that deck would play a whole suite of removal. They'd be playing unholy heats, they'd be playing fatal pushes, and so a lot of their cards would actually then become dead. And so you can make these type of decisions to circumvent some of the more traditional routes that your opponent was taking. All decks in the metagame, or most of them, played creatures in some way. Heck, even the Storm deck would play some type of mana reducer, and so you had value by killing those. But when you kind of circumvented the idea that you don't, care about the removal, then a lot of their cards became dead. And so they were drawing these cards that now even had a more decisive kind of power to them, where now your counter spells aren't just about countering your opponent's counter magic or countering your opponent's removal. It might just be that you don't need to play any type of removal. I might be faster than my opponent. And so they now have to think about, where am I on the axis? Am I the attacker? Am I the defender? It really trips people up, just like on all of these various different points. So when you're able to take that away from your opponent and take the regular angles that they already have and flip them on their head, it really makes a lot of people upset and just
some players will tend to assume the worst in absence of evidence. This can lead to accusations of the deck and the strategy being your choice of brain dead, flowcharty, overtuned, or whatever else.
So brain dead, very common thing that a lot of people say. Overtuned, I've never heard that with mill. Flowcharty, I've actually only ever heard in the fighting game community, referring to the fact that you just, if A happens, you press B. If B happens, you do whatever. So if someone throws out a kick, you block. If someone throws out a low kick, you do this. If someone throws in a jump, you anti-air, like whatever, right? Like you do all this stuff. So it's flowcharty. But you have to be adaptive. And that's like true in any situation of Magic. Just because my opponent fetches, again, I'm going to use modern as a constant example here, but every time my opponent fetches doesn't mean I throw out my archive traps. If I know I'm playing against Arclight Phoenix Am I going to feed their graveyard for free? Absolutely not. I don't have a surgical. I don't have a soul guide lantern. I don't want to throw these out for free to the point where they can take advantage of them. So you have to be very careful about when you throw out certain abilities. A lot of these archetypes, you know, a lot of opponents don't give credit to the micro decisions that you have to make.
This may also apply to other alternate win conditions, of course. Let's say collectathon victories like coalition victory in MTG.
This needs to be
that one happens to actually be kind of overtuned in certain contexts, so maybe a better example would be Lyra Festival in Altered TCG. Most alternate win conditions, mill included, will put an opponent in that place of low empathy towards the player of these win cons, and that will paint them and the strategy in a negative light. Now, for a mill-specific element, since that last one was kind of generalized, there is that feeling one gets when they see a card they would have liked to play next turn, leave the top of their deck, go to the graveyard, never to be seen again.
And they're probably going to touch on this, but that is extremely random. Like it is almost the same chance that I mill that card over is the same chance that that card is stuck at the bottom of your deck. It's that visual indicator, that psychological, you know, fallacy that I could have drawn this, right? But you did not know that was there, right? The whole idea that, you know, yeah, oh my God, you know, I lost this game. I'm going to keep drawing 3 cards and oh my God, I could have won if I went this way. One thing I like to tell people is like, you know, the last thing you want to do is if you feel like you struggle, you know, psychologically with your mental, you feel like you take a lot from your losses and everything, don't draw cards, because all it does is serve to create a negative feedback loop for yourself, making you rethink all of your decisions. One thing that Bryant Cook talks about a lot in his videos, especially as a combo player, is you can make a lot of the correct decisions and the wrong situation still happens. Your opponent still has this, your opponent still interacts this way. They, you know, they always have the answer. You could still play around it. You could make the optimal decision. You can make the correct decision statistically in that situation and it will still end up wrong. It doesn't mean it is wrong. It just meant that your opponent had it. You made the correct decision based on the options that you had. So if you lose in that game, don't draw those cards. Looking at those next few cards doesn't serve to do anything, and all it does is add to your salt. Just like this, these are unknowns. The cards that I'm milling over are all unknowns, unless you're stacking them with some massive recross the paths. It's all unknown. Just like when you're playing Nami in the One Piece TCG, it's, you know, in a lot of ways, like at the beginning of the game, I don't really know the order of my deck, but once you play a bunch of searchers and you're stacking the bottom of your deck by, you know, grabbing a card and you take the next 4 and you put them at the bottom, like once you're stacking your deck, it can become a little bit easier. And that's where like the high skill of like a Nami player can really like come into play. But that's like a deep, like level 2, level 3 type of play of that deck. So it's like, it's not really as kind of flow charty as people give it credit for, especially self-mill where you have a lot more control. But when you're milling opponent,
that feeling of being stopped from playing the milled card is often discounted as being a new player instinct, especially so in MTG, I find. And it makes a modicum of sense, since before the top card of my deck is revealed, I don't really have access to it either way. Until that happens, it's equally likely to be any card from my deck, the best one or the worst one. A sort of Schrodinger's card, if you will. It is not yet the card I would have liked.
For those of you who don't know, so this is Lorcana.
Any card from my deck, the best one.
So Jafar says during your turn, while this character is exerted, whenever you draw a card, you gain 1 lore. So lore is how you win the game. You can win by your opponent decking out, or you can win by gaining 20 lore. So the whole thing in Lorcana is that you can sing songs. So songs are these big powerful spells that your characters can sing for free. So this one says, you know, this one can sing a relatively like more powerful card. And so you have this card called A Whole New World. Each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. So the whole point of like a mill deck that you could build is having more cards in your deck, or maybe looping cards back into your deck and then casting A Whole New World over and over and over again. And the combo with Jafar and Whole New World is that Jafar can sing A Whole New World, and then while it's tapped, so it's exerted, you need to exert your character to sing the song. So you exert your character to sing it, you cast Whole New World. Every time you draw a card, you gain 1 lore. You gain 1 lore, you gain 7 lore. Essentially, so you're milling and you're growing your alternate win condition. So the mill deck was like really fun in this game. It wasn't necessarily competitive because you could just do better things, which instead of milling, it was better to just gain the lore. But I like the fact that they pointed out Jafar here.
A sort of Schrodinger's card, if you will. It is not yet the card I would have liked to play until it's revealed, potentially via being milled. Unless I place that card there myself through an effect like Brainstorm or a sleight of hand technique known as cheating, of course. So even though the specific card is physically there and it is physically getting removed, it's kind of the same instinct as hoping I would have shuffled my deck differently. It would have probably put me in a materially better position, especially if my shuffling sucks, but it's not something I or the opponent had much control over, so it's probably not productive to focus on it too much.
Right.
Still, this doesn't mean that having a card from your deck removed never matters. There is context to consider here. Let's say if the mill player was able to choose what they mill and they consciously targeted the best cards in your deck, that would be a very different story. And a story like this might be written by decks like Magic the Gathering's Lantern Control, which causes the opponent to play with the top card of their deck revealed and mills it or allows it to be drawn depending on what it is. As you might imagine, the cards they allow the opponent to draw are mostly dead draws, like lands or cards that do nothing in the matchup. In that sense,
the worst card of the boon cycle. The boon cycle, you got Dark Ritual gaining you mana, Ancestral gaining you 3 cards, Lightning Bolt dealing 3 damage, green being Giant Growth. Yo, Healing Salve gaining 3 life. Yo, shout out to white consistently being one of the worst colors in this game. Consistently, honestly. Yo, best colors in this game by top order is got to be blue, black, green, red, white. That's my take. And to be fair, the red can switch depending on the format that you're in, but I largely think it's for higher level formats, blue is definitely like the higher format you go, it's definitely blue. Black, red, probably interchangeable with removal and aggression. Green is definitely better than white.
Causes a very real and very justified sense of irritation connected to having your best cards removed. And that happens when your opponent does so consciously. However, another example...
So this adds to the fact that if you're playing against a deck and you're milling, if you mill over like a 1-of or something like that. So currently in Modern, if you're playing against something like a Green Sun Zenith deck, we see in the Amulet Titan decks a lot more 1-ofs these days. If you mill over that 1-of that, you feel like, as the Amulet player, you feel like could have helped you overcome that matchup. It can really help you.
What we would like to consider is if they reach the same outcome, that is removing your best card through sheer luck. And that is kind of circling back to that first example that we discounted as newbie instinct. However, there are situations where that outcome is way more likely to happen. And both we the players and we the designers, have some control over how often these situations of higher likelihood will arise. We don't control the card that might hit us, but we choose whether or not we stand in the middle of the street, so to speak. I should be a writer. So, sure, there are cases where having your best card milled is not a huge consideration. That's the majority of constructed MTG, actually, where decks have a good bit of internal redundancy. They are playing a lot of 4-ofs, they have multiple sets of 4-ofs that accomplish similar things. Let's say if it's an aggressive deck, they probably have multiple sets of 4 that are attacking aggressively statted creatures. So even if one of those gets milled, let's say you had 16 of them in your deck out of the 40 cards remaining, now that one got milled, you have 15 out of 39, which is not that much worse in terms of your likelihood of drawing one if you wanted to draw one for next turn. One being milled slightly increases the likelihood of the remaining 15 being drawn, so it's even less impactful than it might seem at first glance.
Got a little bit of math for y'all.
2.5% decrease, 1 out of 16, but more of a 1.5%. But there are occasions that can contextually increase the likelihood of having a card milled be a big deal. Let's say I'm only running 1 of win conditions in my deck, without a way to...
So you see this often against like ad nauseum decks in Modern, or just most Thassa's Oracle strategies. There usually is like one kind of win condition. Notably against like the Grinding Station Underworld Breach deck, they don't care if you mill it over. If you mill over their Grape Shot, they can just cast it again from the yard. So it can be a little bit difficult in that scenario. So there's a lot of like built-in ways that a lot of strategies can kind of overcome what you're doing. In Modern Mill, the best type of strategy that we have right now is taking advantage of what we mill over. So, for example, if your opponent is a creature-based strategy, you might be main decking a Crypt Incursion to take advantage and gain some life and give yourself the turns you need to win. But along their example of having critical mass of certain cards against the burn strategies, the what I like to coin as the quality or quantity strategies, where they have a high quantity of a certain amount of effect. And so burn, I'm thinking about like a high quantity of lightning bolts. If I mill over 4 lightning bolts, it doesn't matter because they're going to find their Skewer the Critics. They're going to find the new like Foundations bolt they just printed as well. They're going to find their critical mass of spells. And so I need to kind of attack them at a different angle. I don't want to be casting Surgical Extraction to take out certain cards, although I might if I want to take out high CMC stuff for Atasha's, but that's very like kind of unique specific stuff. In a general sense, the quality decks is what we kind of do well against in Modern, specifically thanks to the power of Surgical Extraction. And I think honestly, if you were to print Surgical Extraction into Pioneer, that would probably largely save that format against combo, because Lord knows if y'all are a combo metagame, I can solve that with the Surgical Extraction.
Them for the sake of the argument. And
what is this ad? Oh,
that can
shout out to that Superman trailer, by the way.
Happen quite often if I'm playing a control deck and I'm confident in my ability to prolong the game until I can draw into those one-offs. So I don't really need to include multiple copies because I will eventually get access to the one that I have. Or if I'm playing a deck that relies on tutors to get specific cards out of my deck. I will also not need to include redundant copies because I'll just tutor out the specific cards that I need. Then, mill is way more likely to work as a form of resource denial, much like it did.
But it also can, because
However,
the chances of you milling that card over is a lot less, right? So there have been situations where, I'm trying to take out a certain card and they like, I've seen it happen against Living End. I've seen it happen where, they have 4 Living Ends initially, and then they actually board down to like 2 or, whatever, sometimes even 1, even though that's bad, like 2 Living Ends. And so my chances of milling it over and grabbing it with a surgical are a lot less, and getting a lot less value out of it. Since the cards
milled here are still random, unlike for Lantern Control, it's not a form of resource denial that either player has much control over. But still, it's a potential surprise win condition against some of these decks. And remember, if you hit any of these cards, if you hit any of my payoffs, even if you don't nick up my deck fully, you will also decrease the power of the tutors that I use to get them out of the deck. A kind of 2-for-1. You not only remove a useful card, but also turn a tutor into a dead draw if it has nothing to get out of my deck. In card games like Pokemon, it's entirely possible for Mill to turn off strategies that rely on tutoring up specific cards from their deck. Since all Pokemon decks are pretty much combo decks, they are often so fine-tuned that there is not much space left for redundancy. If you hit the 1 or 2 copies of a key card they have, they may just fold. Indeed, cards like Misfortune Sisters are run in heavy control decks like Snorlax Stall, which is a deck that wins by deck out technically, but not by proactively milling your opponent's deck, but rather by locking a useless Pokemon in your opponent's active zone and, passing the turn 60 times, causing them to run out of cards organically. Misfortune Sisters not necessarily run here to mill the opponent faster, to quicken the clock, though that is a bonus, but rather to lower the number of outs the opponents have. Cards like Canceling Cologne or Switch cards that can allow them to get out from under the lock. Since most decks don't run that many copies of either, if you hit 1 or 2, you can change a potential loss into a very time-consuming win. So being an unexpected win condition against these low redundancy strategies
You see this, a good example that I've been coming across recently with creativity being really good in modern is you can make creativity largely redundant because a lot of times out of the board, especially, they don't have an alternative creativity target. Sometimes they do. Sometimes it might be like an Elish Norn or something like that. But a lot of times you can surgical creativity out of, especially game one, not creativity, sorry, you can surgical the Archon, and then that makes persist and creativity pretty much dead cards. So that's a good way to like where you're able to like take out a greedy situation with a card like surgical extraction, mill out one of the Archon, surgical that, and you shut down like so many cards, similar to the Death Shadow example I was providing where you board out your crabs and you make all of their removal kind of dead.
And being a win condition that often relies on randomly hitting the right cards is another source of friction working against mill, especially in the eyes of players of these archetypes that are affected by it. And while that may sound somewhat healthy, I will be the first to agree that it does punish greedy deck building choices. There can often be rule sets or even entire games where one can't really add more redundancy into one's deck. Singleton formats like EDH, where playing more than one copy of a specific card is not a feasible way to add more redundancy, or, you know, the entirety of Marvel Snap with its extremely small singleton decks. And that leads...
I used to play Marvel Snap. Can someone in the comment section let me know, like, have they made a mill deck yet? I feel like they wouldn't because of how small their decks are.
To another element I would like to consider. That mill is not really fought as much at the playing the match level, rather during deck building. It both punishes and is in turn punished by deck building choices. This is not great for feeling like you have agency during the match, which I think is something that all card games should ideally strive for, because there's few things players hate more than feeling like they lost the match at its very start just based
But see, this is my number one problem with mill hate, right? Like, and I think this comes from like a very casual thing. It happens in all games. Like, people like the ability to just do simple things and win simply, right? Like, people just like the fact that they have a strategy and they want to go about that strategy. That is the same thing as what I'm doing. I am affecting you the same way that a control deck counters all your stuff and removes your cards, the same way that a burn deck gets you dead on turn 3 because they had the nuts, the same way that creature of course has trample. Like, the same way every other strategy is beating you is the same way that I'm taking away your cards and all of a sudden your hand goes to draw from an empty library. It's the same thing, it's just psychologically it's set up different. You as the mill hater cannot separate that for yourself. That's your fault. Right. And I had someone like recently on a YouTube post tell me like, yo, as someone who's been playing for over 30 years, like, you need to stop playing mill, this scrub tactic. Bro, screw off. Get bent. Like, I'm gonna be throwing archive traps till the day I die. All right. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do with mill in every archetype.
But mill is generally fought in that deck building arena. Because first of all, it's rare for it to share counter cards with any other playstyle. It completely blanks life gain. It ignores defensive creatures. So most card games balance it by printing very powerful ways to combat it specifically, if you know to prepare for it, and include them at the deck building stage.
Yep.
Those will most often be extremely low tempo against everything else, but provide overwhelming amounts of value against mill specifically.
Unless you print endurance. Unless you print endurance. I don't give a crap about freaking Emrakul. Emrakul, I could care less about Emrakul. Endurance is a busted and poorly designed Magic card. I will say that I will say that forever. And unfortunately, it is poorly designed and works really well against an archetype that a lot of people hate. And so those people just refuse to have better answers, do better things. You know, free spells are okay when you're beating mill, right? They don't want to have that conversation though. Everyone hates Force of Will, but when you got endurance against mill, that's okay.
A great
Problem
example
against that.
are
Whoa.
Eldrazi Titans from MTG. You don't expect to play them that often since they are very expensive, but the
Right.
mere inclusion of one of these in your deck causes a mill opponent to have to jump through so many additional hoops.
Our track record doesn't lie. Seriously, come and see for yourself. Get to know investing done differently.
On a different front, mill often coexists with other irritating mechanics. I blame Magic having mill primarily in blue, the color of counter spells that everybody hates, but even in games like Pokemon, I really got into Pokemon these past few months.
Drink responsibly, y'all. A little bit of... Oh, Lord, a little bit of birthday cake cream.
Not sure if you can tell, by the way. Great Tusk Mill often plays one of stall pieces like Mimikyu or Cornerstone Ogre Pawn EX, and negative interaction like TM Devolution, Neutralization Zone, or Airy, often perceived as time-wasting or mean. Historical examples include Durant Mill playing Lost Remover and Crushing Hammer, also negative interaction intended to slow down the opponent, and this is kind of a feedback loop. Since Mill is already perceived as irritating and a form of negative interaction, it's way more likely to be printed alongside other cards.
Okay, small OCD, but you notice how this is rotating in the opposite direction from the arrows? Why? Why is this rotating from the opposite direction of the arrows?
Factions and classes that are, control, stall, or other things associated with negative interactions. Mill is also often present on effects that don't require you to keep up board presence. As such, it can come across as non-interactive, and in some cases, it just is non-interactive.
A very good example of this is self-mill. Very good example of this is self-mill. It can be seen, like, although you are interacting in the highest form, right? So Nami mill in the One Piece TCG is a good example of this. Like, you are playing defensive spells over and over again. You are trying to sequence them in an appropriate way. You're trying to set up your own deck. Largely, you are playing the game for yourself. You are trying to solve your own puzzle that the opponent presents to you, right? And that can be seen as uninteractive. You're not really working with their threats. You're not attacking into their stuff. Sometimes you are, but really when it comes to self-mill strategies, you are playing defensive. You're trying to amass a certain amount of cards, and over a series of turns and interactions, you ultimately get to 0, or you play the Thassa's Oracle and you win, whatever it might be.
It's not a given, of course. Pokemon Mill tends to require you to have a Pokemon with the necessary move in the active zone, like Great Tusk here, allowing for it to be knocked out. But Magic Mill decks, for example, are often reliant on instant and sorcery cards.
Shout out to Archive
with
Trap.
Some artifacts, enchantments, and creatures playing kind of...
Shut up. Fraying Sanity, get this out of here. Fraying Sanity's been the biggest red herring in so many decks, but shout out to Mesmericorp. Can someone comment down below Mesmericorp, and everyone else find that comment and like that comment? I'm gonna pin the first person that says Mesmericorp. Shout out to Mesmericorp for being one of the single best mill spells out there.
Supporting role. So perhaps your removal is not fully dead, it can get rid of this Hedron Crab, but your opportunities for counterplay will mostly be, hey, do you have
the Bruvac plus the Glimpse?
Instant speed answer to this one-shot effect with a narrow window of response?
And
or do you want to have 15 of your cards milled? On the narrative side, for a change, since we mentioned that Mill plays the game on a different axis, gameplay-wise, the primary axis being combat for most card games, it also generally has a different theming. Magic's Mill is about breaking the opposing mage's mind, in a game primarily about dealing bodily harm via summoned monsters or fireballs, which is an equally compelling way to win for me, but
so traditionally Mill has been associated with like the Demir household, and so it is about deception, lies, and secrecy, achieving what you want through elusiveness and intellect that isn't clear, right? And so you see this come out in many ways that Mill operates, not even just in modern and heck, even in older formats where it's more combo oriented, but in kind of fresher formats like Pioneer, Standard, whatever, you see Mill come out in those type of ways, kind of circumventing, you're having to loop certain artifacts or enchantments, and you might have like Rogue Mill, and you know, it's the theming around it is not Boros and you know, initiative and creatures coming through, and it's not building giant armies of, you know, forests and creating life and, you know, all that stuff. No, it is secrecy, it is deception, it's all that stuff. So at least in Magic, that is what it's associated
space
with.
For personal preference to come into play, resulting in Mill being less popular with the player cohort who view that sort of stuff as lame compared to fireballs. Other examples, like Pokemon, may be a bit more suspect. In a game primarily about creature combat, the act of playing the card game being a symbolic representation of the sport of Pokemon fighting, Mill represents victory via something else. You're not defeating your opponent's mons per se. The closest approximation of what Mill symbolizes in my Great Task deck that I can take a guess at is digging a big enough hole. My headcanon is that there is a lesser known technicality in the Pokemon League's comprehensive rules set that if you dig a big enough hole, the judges have to give you the win.
Oh God, with line collapse, that's hilarious.
In the cement industry.
Yo, these ads are going crazy, but shout out to this user for
of global CO.
shout out to this
Jokes
user for
aside,
getting
the
the
Pokemon TCG's theming of Mill has been kind of all over the place. We have hole digging on Great Task, eating stuff on Durant, we have Charizard GX burning your opponent's cards,
discard the top 10 cards of your opponent's decks.
which I like. Beware confusing your opponent, I think, and Tyranitar V calling down an avalanche. It's equally as varied from a narrative design standpoint as the ways to deal damage are, but since damage represents, well, damage, bodily harm, we can easily interpret how fire, avalanches, spraying pressurized water might contribute to damage being dealt. So I think the default...
Yeah, like there are situations, I mean, you know, people are going to bring up that artifact that a lot of mill decks in EDH will play where whenever a player receives damage or whenever an opponent takes damage, they mill that many cards. And so that's part of many an infinite combo out there. And so there's ways where when, I mean, there was that recent creature that was printed, blue. I think it was like a 10-1 or something like that. I don't know, whatever. It was some like big creature. And whenever, you know, it attacked, if it was like instead of dealing damage, it milled that many cards or something like that. So there's all different types of ways where they tried to make mill viable through creatures. And it's like, oh, you have Jace's Phantasm where it's like, okay, it's not really about milling, but it's like an alternate win condition. It's a payoff kind of for mill.
Put damage on stuff effects have a bit less pressure to justify themselves making sense compared to mill. And potentially the final element here is that mill occasionally requires the opponent to kind of go against the grain when it comes to playing their deck. For example, if my deck generally wants to draw lots of cards fast, cycle through stuff with reckless abandon, just go, you know, go hard. Mill might make me not do that in order to not run out of cards and cede the victory to them. It might make me adopt a slower pace consciously, and even though the context here is different, I am slowing down to increase my chances of winning. The experience of not drawing cards, equating in my mind to being in a bad position, losing, having a bricked hand, is imprinted in me to the degree that it still might feel bad.
So it's like creating that negative feeling. So a good example of this is like how a mill player might be able to abuse this again in the modern format. Again, another situation for I'm forgetting the name of the card, but it's a 1 white 1/1 human, I think artifact soldier. And whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, you put a 1/1 counter on it, and then like you draw a card if they can't pay like the power on it. It was like a humans thing. It was like a taxes creature, all that stuff, whatever, right? It was in Hammer as well. But that card is a forced draw. So a lot of ways that I can manipulate that. Now you're thinking, okay, yeah, I'm drawing a bunch of extra cards every time you cast a non-trigger. Just well, haha, I'm gonna be able to draw my hammer, draw this, draw that. Well, in the late game, over the course of a game, I may have actually gotten you to draw 5, 6, heck, 7, 8 cards. That's almost a free glimpse of the unthinkable. That is 2 crab triggers, whatever, right? Like, I have accumulated that value over time, and then at the end of the game, I might be able to use that to my advantage to force you to draw cards, because again, it is not a may trigger, it is a force trigger. So a lot of situations, control decks might opt to not draw cards. They might opt to not brainstorm, or, you know, in a weird situation, if your opponent's playing Thought Scour, they might choose to mill me and then draw off the Thought Scour, kind of something like that. So thinking of how they have to change their game plan and adapt against even something like Nami. When you're playing against Nami in the One Piece TCG, you know, you don't want to get hit as the Nami player, and your counters are drawing you cards. And so the opponent would look to build up a board, not attack, not activate any counters, and understand that I can only counter out a certain amount of cards per turn based on the amount of resources that I have. And so they will build up a board full of giant characters. And so then they will add a bunch of Dawn and attack with giant attack power, and not attack one at a time. They'll attack with wide boards, confirm 2 to 3 damage per turn, and whittle down my resources that way, under like attacking with overwhelming odds on certain characters. And that's the way a lot of decks are able to beat Nami.
Kind of like having a sports car, but still having to go the speed limit. You are staying safe, you are avoiding a ticket,
Interesting analogy.
but it also kind of feels like you just have a slow car. Hopefully that was a relatable parallel for the droves of sports car drivers in my audience. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed. This was the mill video. Let me know in the comments what your favorite mill card is.
Interesting. I like this video. Let me know in the comment section down below if you'd like me to see more of their videos. What is this? Magic the Gathering has a radicalization problem. Ooh, this one. Interesting. You know what? Like in general, as I take a look through their channel, I'll give them a subscribe. That was a fun one. I think, this was a recent one too, 4K, like a couple months ago and everything. So I think one of the more interesting parts about Mill is that not only does it provide that frustrating piece against your opponent, but it's very beatable. It's just, it really brings out the casual for many players, people that don't know how to beat this strategy. They don't know how to circumvent the axis to which I'm putting you on. And it is very beatable. For some strategies, it's not. And that's okay. I think some people are just overwhelmed by the fact that they are so unfavored by something. So many strategies like in modern Tron and Amulet Titan, strategies that have such a poor matchup against Mill that they get bogged down by the fact that they're not able to beat them the overwhelming majority of time. But a lot of skilled pilots can overcome a lot of these situations. They can find the win against Mill, and it can be easy based on your sequencing when you decide to fetch and give into an archive trap, like how you play around certain things, when to go for something, when not. Like there's certain ways that you can protect against it. Especially, one way I think about it is in Tron. Like a lot of times you may not want to go for natural Tron, but you may want to spend a certain amount of turns, like actually looking for something like a Relic of Progenitus. There was a time when Relic was a main board option. Faithless Looting was still legal in Modern way back before it was unbanned, and banned, sorry. But you played Relic of Progenitus in the main board of Tron, and that was a great answer to something like Surgical Extraction. And when I milled out enough, it was a great answer against Visions of Beyond to stop me from drawing more resources. And so there are certain options that you have as a unfavored matchup, as a different strategy to overcome this. A lot of aggressive strategies, and heck, even in Modern Mill, a lot of mid-range matchups just have like really good matchups, because Mill at the end of the day is a mid-range deck. A lot of people call it burn for intellectuals. Haha. Mill is a mid-range deck in Modern, at least. In Legacy, it's largely a combo deck. But I mean, if you're playing Painter, it's a mid-range deck with an I win button that is a Mill win condition. But semantics. At the end of the day, Mill just brings out the casual. It brings out the frustration in the player, because you just lose a lot of control in the game plan that you have set out. I think they touched on a lot of kind of in between points there that kind of add up to that. So you know what, fair video. Give that video a like, give it some views off the background. And again, don't just go over and leave a like and leave. That's not great for the algorithm. Go leave it running in the background, give it its time in the limelight. I'm very interested to see what some of the other videos are from this creator. So definitely might react to some more stuff in the future from them.